Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. It is a great honor for me to present our keynote speaker for the One Atlantic Many Perspectives Conference, Professor Onésimo de Almeida. If there is a person that who truly embodies the transatlantic spirit and the multiplicity of perspectives that that the Atlantic brings and that this conference aims to discuss, is without a doubt Professor Onésimo. I believe it would be redundant to provide a detailed account of Professor Onésimo Almeida's curriculum vitae here. He's certainly well known to all of you. And as a wise friend once told me, the more time needed to introduce a speaker, the less relevant the speaker actually is. And come to think of it, it might have been Onésimo who taught me that a few years ago. However, his personal and professional life truly has a transatlantic dimension. Professor Onésimo was born in São Miguel. He soon settled in the United States to complete his PhD in philosophy at Brown University. In this case, he is really a philosophy doctor, as a PhD in PH, right? He spent his entire professional career at this prestigious Ivy League institution, where he served as a professor and for many years as the chair of the Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies, helping to make this department one of the most, if not the most renowned department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies in the United States. Beyond his career excuse me? I will, just 2 or 3 more paragraphs. Beyond his career as a professor, advisor, mentor, inspiration for many generations of students, Americans, Portuguese Americans, many other students. And beyond his role as department chair, Onésimo Almeida has an extensive body of published work, hundreds of works, including books, chapters, articles, essays, short stories, chronicles, interviews, and so on. Many of these works have explored the Atlantic and the transatlantic world, particularly the cultures and the identities of the Azorean diaspora, a diaspora topic to which he has always linked his reflections or his obsessions on Portugal, Portuguese identity, national identity. Much will remain unsaid in this presentation. I promise to be brief, but much will remain unsaid, particularly regarding his civic engagement, the humanism that permeates his conduct and his behavior, his generosity, his constant concern for the other, his ongoing willingness to help others and to make the world a better place for others. These aspects of his life, of his CV, cannot be quantified as books or articles. But ultimately, these are the most important ones in defining one's personality and one's life's journey. So Professor Onésimo Almeida is without a doubt, I have to say this, one of the greatest contemporary figures of Azorean and national culture, and therefore, dear Onésimo, it's a great honor and a privilege for us to have your presence here at the LPAZ Forum, One Atlantic, Many Perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's embarrassing because now everything I say is going to say, is this what this guy has to tell us? Well, my main job here is to keep you awake. It's late. There was this, once I read in the Boston Herald American, a journalist interviewed a bunch of professors from the Boston area and asked them in the end, the questions were the same. Tell us a true story that happened in your classroom. And he said, one day I saw this young student, a woman, sleeping in my class. So I turned to the guy next to her and said, would you please wake up your your friend there. He said, "Me? You do it. You were the one who put her to. You were the one who put her to sleep." So I'm going to try to keep you awake as my first job. The second thing I'd like to say is, this is called the keynote address. I think a keynote speech is in the beginning. It sets the tone for, and I wrote the keynote. It should have been read in the beginning because a lot of what I'm going to say here has already been said. So, but now how can I cut when I'm reading what's been said? So you're going to repeat and to hear a lot of things, because what I have to say about this stuff, I already said. This should be done. This speech should be done by a young person with new ideas. I've said, I've written, and it reminds me of a story, true story. One day I was going to go to Portugal, and I received a call from this Brazilian professor at the University of Minho, and he said, "Onésimo, it has to be in Brazilian Portuguese. Vi que você vem a Portugal." Sim, I heard you coming to Portugal. Yeah. Não dá saltinho aqui a Braga, botar uma falinha para a gente? Can't you just come up to Braga and give a talk to us? And I said, "Brian, I'm leaving tomorrow. I don't have time to write anything." "Oh, doesn't matter. Do an ecological thing." I said, "Brian, I speak already about too many things, and now about ecology, I know nothing about ecology." "Ah, você não sabe o que é uma coisa ecológica?" He said, "No, recycle. So recycle. So what I have here is what I did was I just recycled things I've said before. So it's nothing new. So actually, I'm not going to be concerned with keeping you awake. You can sleep because this has been said before. I've written about it before. So I'll wake you up in the end. In the Azores, geography marks us, and it marked me doubly so, as it marked my islander forebears. If from a genetic standpoint, we almost all descend from the Lusitanian rectangle, I like to call it rectangle, and I like to add that there's a big discussion, there used to be a big discussion in the US among the communities. Well, I'm from the Azores. No, you're from Portugal West, but I'm from the Azores. And this raised lots of times, this became a serious debate. And I used to say, look, if someone says, I want to buy a ticket to the Azores, if I say to Portugal, but I want to go to the Azores, then they send me to Lisbon. So these are two real entities. One day I was talking to a minister, and the minister was concerned, and he said, "Onésimo, this is serious here," because he was so afraid of this independence spirit still remaining in the community. It bothers me. I hear Azores. It's Portugal. And I said, I'm going to tell you one thing, that the issue is very clear to me. There's a country that has three components: mainland Portugal, the rectangle, the region of Azores, and the region of Madeira. And last I checked in the Constitution, this country is called República Portuguesa. So that settles it. So you can go on talking, Katia can go on talking about Azores and talking about Portugal. These are two components of a country called República Portuguesa, according to the Constitution of this country. It's perfectly legitimate. So the minister kept quiet, and the issue has almost died. Anyway, so if from a genetic standpoint, we almost all descend from the Lusitanian rectangle, with a few adventitious additions of varied provenance, including the Flemish, our insular history molded us in equal measure, as Vitorino Nemésio well saw in affirming that for us, geography is worth as much as history. When Nemésio made that affirmation, it was in the midst of an anti-geography wave in reaction to the geographical determinism that was the thesis of such works as Civilization and Climate by Ellsworth Huntington, who in the first quarter of the 20th century, 1915, with a revised edition published in 1922, formalized the dominant paradigm. The reaction surged in the US primarily in response to the aberration of Nazism. given its obsession with the climate science of the day, namely that the people of the cooler north were inherently superior to those of the hotter south. Nemesio, with his intuitive spirit shaped by a profound attentiveness to the empirical world that surrounded him, proclaimed his clairvoyant findings to the four corners of the world. In truth, geography has been the dominant conditioning factor of Azorean history. It is she that truly has made her mark on history and not the other way around. Everything began almost immediately upon the initial discoveries. In little more than 2 decades, the observant Portuguese sailors had already surmised that they could travel down the African coast without straying very far from the continent itself, though the further south they ventured, they'd be caught by the winds and maritime currents, and their ships would inevitably end up in the Azorean seas, following a route that would later be known as Volta do Largo, the long way back. The Azores, thus, became a necessary stop to support the ships, as that course obliged the sailors to go weeks and months without fresh food and water, and for that reason, upon making landfall, those primary needs had to be attended to. Aside from that, the ships had to be restocked, as the return voyage to Lisbon still took 3 weeks to complete. At that time, the central role fell to Angra for a very simple reason. It was the only bay sufficiently large and deep enough, and was also protected from the southwesterly winds, which are predominant in the Azores. Which is to say, our collective existence came about from the imperative to perform a vital function in the grand plan that we know today resulted in the first globalization. It was our first reason for being. During the reign of the 3 Philips, we remained a way station for Spain's ships, confirming our role as a hub and supplier of support services. With the fading energy that took us to India and Japan, the Azoreans began to feel a lack of usefulness. Meanwhile, the kingdom understood the urgency of sending people to the south of Brazil. Our existence thus remembered, and the Portuguese crown, certainly availing itself of the surplus island demographic, sought to send colonists to occupy the territory that the Spanish from Uruguay onward craved control of. My wife and I were at Colonia del Sacramento a few months ago. This was the first great bridge to the other side of the Atlantic, namely to Santa Catarina and Rio Grande of the South, or Rio Grande do Sul, in the first half of the 18th century, a bridge that has been subsequently reinforced in the last 40 years, allowing for a healthy circulation, though reduced mostly to an elite. It is within that same century, now in its second half, that the American whaling ships, for reasons identical to those that led to the Portuguese using these islands as a base of transatlantic connection, began to harbor them as well, transforming them to a vital source of support as well as valuable labor. The first settlers, who were brought from the interior of Portugal with a mission to cultivate the land in order to resupply the ships, they always lived by the grace of the incredibly fertile volcanic soil given them by nature. A portion of those people, traditionally bound to the land, turned themselves into seafarers on the American whaling ships and ventured through the South Atlantic routes and on through Alaska by the Pacific. Herman Melville, the great American writer of that era, considered setting down in his classic Moby Dick that how it is, there's no telling, but islanders, and he was referring to, he had mentioned earlier, Azoreans, Icelanders, and Cape Verdeans, seem to make the best whalemen. In the 2 centuries that followed, the Azoreans headed almost exclusively to the Americas, primarily to the north, establishing a strong link that endures today. Those that immigrated to the south left a fainter trace, though fortunately their memory has been reunited, as I said before, over the past half century. For a long time, Brazil, here in the Azores, was for us the land of the forgotten, a terra dos esquecidos. North America, by contrast, was quick to catch the Azorean imagination. Much as in Mau Tempo no Canal, by Trin Nemésio, the search in the second half of the 1400s of a supposed 10th island to the north of the Azores symbolized for the protagonist of the novel, Margarida, looking for an impossible happiness, as the Azorians, who in their bones always felt difficult privations and multiple shortcomings, did not believe that their lands were the fortunate islands, or the islands of happiness, as they were known. Makaroni Nisia. Makaroni means happiness in Greek, Nisia Islands, hence Macaronesia. This was how the American dream began to take shape. The Californias lost in abundance, or in Bert George's translation of the poem by Flores-born poet Pedro da Silveira, the bountiful Californias. At this point, Horta in Fayal had become the intercontinental point of connection between Europe and America. The reasons for this were once again practical ones. Harboring in the island of Flores would be expected for the American boats, as it was the first to reveal itself to them after the long journey across the Atlantic. But the island was surrounded by treacherous shallows, and furthermore, it lacked an adequate bay. Fayal seemed a better option, despite its bay being far from ideal. From that challenge sprung the idea to build an artificial dock, a goal that took some time to be realized, but that perfectly resolved the issue. The relationship between the Azores and the US continued to intensify when, during the steam power era, ships traveling between Europe and America stopped here. However, that role only became newly vital when the need arose to connect underwater cables from North America to Europe and later to South Africa. It was still only during the First and Second World Wars that the strategic importance of the Azores tightened the bond between these islands and America, now from the departure point of Terceira, but also from Santa Maria, as the propeller planes of the fledgling commercial airline business required a refueling post in the middle of the Atlantic. But that story all of you know far better than I. In my first travels to the US from 1970 onward, I always had to depart from Santa Maria. Ironically, the latest grand feeling of relevance of the archipelago came about when it began to be understood that in a non-nuclear conflict, the strategic importance of the Azores would be vital to the US and consequently to Europe. This was mentioned here before. During the Yom Kippur War in 1973, October, it became abundantly clear that the American base in Lajes was essential. The Pentagon declared that the Azores and Iceland were the two most important geostrategic assets for the US. I believe this may be the moment to tell a story I've never spoken of in public. It has to do precisely with the Lajes base and the loss of its significance due to disinterest on the part of the US. In 2013, I was made aware by a friend who at the time worked for the State Department that the US had decided to decommission the Lajes base as they considered it to have become unimportant. For budgetary reasons, they thought it made sense to eliminate it. However, the US was going to open a new one, a fourth one, in the United Kingdom. So much for economic reasons. So politics were behind. United Kingdom had more power than Portugal. The person that had alerted me asks if I thought that the Azorean government had knowledge of this development and of the negative impact it would have on the Terceira economy. Lacking a timely intervention, once the American executive branch made its decision, it would be too late to intercede. The process would be irreversible. At the time, I was part of the board of PALCUS, the Portuguese American Leadership Council of the US. Dinesh is now part of. And at that first meeting, I brought the subject up. The board was interested, but they thought, and it was I who raised the concern, that the Luso-American community should not be alerted without first consulting the Azorean government. I was given the mandate of contacting the government, and since I was briefly to be in Lisbon, I promised to meet with Carlos César, who at that point had left the government and joined the Portuguese parliament, but had a direct line to his successor, Vasco Cordeiro. I'll skip the details for reasons that aren't germane here, though I acknowledge they would be illustrative of how the back channels of politics work, or how they could, at any rate. I was writing letters for both sides. I was writing and they will sign. I'll skip that. Don't tape that. In quick succession, an awareness was triggered in the community, and the request from them was made to Palcos to intervene alongside the Portuguese caucus in Washington, the group of Lusophone and Lusophile politicians. What followed is a matter of public domain, though a scant few had become aware of